For most of his life, my father was not a man who prayed. I asked him about this once, probably when I was a teenager, and he said, well, if God knows everything, then he doesn't need me to pray and tell him what he already knows. And at the time, there was a certain inescapable logic to what my dad said, which I had no answer to. But what I would want to say to my father now, if you're still around, is that prayer is not just about giving God information. True, we believe that God does, in some mysterious way, know everything. But what prayer is about relationship with God. And our praying, our speaking to God about our heart's desires and needs, really is about building a relationship of trust. Now, you who are parents, I'm sure you know this very well from your relationship with your children, that you very often know what your children are doing or have done, but you want them to tell you about it themselves. You don't want to just know secondhand or know from observation. You love it when your children come to you and tell you what's on their mind and what's in their heart. So often when the children are little, you know when they've done something wrong, but you want them to build up that way of trusting you to be able to say, I'm sorry if I did wrong. So many parents I hear tell their children, look, it doesn't matter what you do, I'd much rather you tell me than that you lie or cover it up. And I guess as our children grow older and perhaps become a little bit more of an enigma to us, even then we would love our children to come and open up to us. Parents often bemoan their teenagers, simply give grunted answers sometimes in their middle teenage years. What'd you do at school? Nothing. What are you doing? Nothing. What'd you learn? Nothing. When in fact, we'd love for our children to be able to express themselves to us. And then when they become younger adults and move out of home, we want that relationship to continue. We want our children to tell us directly what's happening in their lives rather than hear it secondhand perhaps from another sibling or someone else. And I think this experience of parenting gives us a glimpse into what God is like. That God desires us to tell him what's going on simply as a part of our act of trust and part of our relationship with him. And we know this because we hear it in Jesus in the gospel this week when Jesus encounters the blind man. Now this blind man is calling out to Jesus, wanting to come near. People try to stop and push him back, but Jesus says, no, bring him over. I want to speak to him. I want to hear from him. And when the man comes forward, Jesus says to him, what is it you want me to do for you? Now, that must have seemed like a very obvious question, probably to the man himself. Obviously, I'm blind. Can't you see, Jesus, this is what I need you to do for me? And yet Jesus doesn't assume. Jesus doesn't just say, well, I know best, I'm going to give it to you whether you want or not. No, Jesus desires for us to express ourselves to him. He wants to draw that forth from us and in us by asking us, what do we want? What do we truly most deeply want? Jesus asks us to speak to him and speak to the Father in prayer. Because Jesus came to reveal who God is and what God is like. And so the things that Jesus said and did in his earthly ministry reveal who God is and what God is like and what God is doing now. Right now, God is desiring that we would have a relationship with him where we trust him, where we speak to him of our deepest hopes and needs and fears and regrets. That God wants to hear all of this from us, not just to read our minds and souls from afar somehow. St. Augustine said that in prayer we should be an interesting phrase, we should exercise our desires in prayer. That's a great phrase, exercise our desires in prayer. Because it means actually that we learn to ponder, what do I truly want? When I sit down with the Lord in prayer and really pray deeply, I'm not going to just pray for what I want and I want a Lamborghini. That's probably not the kind of prayer we're really going to pray. When we sit and ponder God, when we sit and ponder Jesus and his ministry, our deepest desires and hopes and joys and dreams will come up. And then we can exercise our desires, speaking them to the Lord in prayer, and in doing so, get to know ourselves and our needs better as well. So we might use the encounter of Jesus with the blind man as an exercise in prayer ourselves. We might imagine ourselves to be that blind man. Sit down, close your eyes, which helps us to imagine the blindness, but allow that encounter to come forth in your imagination. Hear Jesus. Hear him. Hear his footsteps. Hear his voice. Hear him saying to you, what do you want me to do for you? But when you're in that prayer space, rather than being the blind man wanting to be healed of blindness, be yourself. And allow yourself to say to Jesus whatever it is that arises for you in prayer. Sometimes this might surprise you. What you really want might be a deep desire that's kind of hidden from you until you stop to take time to reflect upon it. So I encourage you to do exactly that, to take time to pray with that passage and encounter Jesus in this way. Because for those of you who've been following the gospel week after week, you might know something quite curious happen. Today we hear Jesus say to the blind man, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And because the man speaks of his deepest need and a really appropriate good need that's aligned with God's will, Jesus grants that healing. But last week we heard the gospel where James and John are clamoring for power and prestige. And we hear Jesus actually say the exact same phrase to them. The brothers say, "Master, we want you to do us a favor." And Jesus says, "What is it you want me to do for you?" But because they're asking something which is wrong, it's actually not good for them, and it's not aligned with the will of God, Jesus pushes back and says, "You don't know what you're asking. You can't have these positions." But he draws them more deeply to say, "But you will drink the cup of suffering with me. You will in fact endure what I endure eventually." So even when our prayers kind of maybe not be what they should be at first, or our desires are not the best thing for us, expressing them in prayer will give God a chance to speak back to our hearts and help to refine and purify our desires. This is something which I find many times where I start praying for something and realize, no, that's actually not what I really needed. It's the Lord speaking to me and helping to refine and purify my desires. That's St. Augustine's phrase, exercising our desires in prayer, coming true and refining our hearts and souls. So hear Jesus say to you today, "What does he want me to do for you?" Open your heart and respond with honesty to whatever may come up.